Hey there, this is Ryan Clancy for this week's edition of No Labels Talks. And here, for the first time since the election, I'm talking to Holly Page because we were not able to talk in the aftermath of last Tuesday. Holly, how you doing?
Ryan, I'm okay. A lot has happened. A lot has
Yes, it did. Also, by the way, it's not that actually we were in Chicago, so we talked plenty. But
Yeah.
we couldn't carve out the time to tape an intro to the podcast. So I don't want
You
to
did
artificially
survive,
make it seem like.
right? You did survive a near-death experience too while we were in Chicago.
All right, I'm going to share this with everybody. The ceiling caved in my hotel room at 1:30 in the morning. It fell on my head. I'm no worse for the wear. I did have a moment where I thought that some of the same people who tried to kill off the No Labels Unity ticket tried to get me in my hotel room in Chicago but they failed. I'm still here.
Not the same thing, not the same thing.
Yep.
And so, Ryan, how did the establishment that you were staying at deal with this collapse? Did they send you flowers? Were there a bottle of champagne?
Very poorly.
Mm.
Yes, I got nothing. Nobody, no, can we give you a free room? We're really sorry this happened. If I was a more litigious person, could have made some noise. I don't do that kind of thing. But even if it was just to cover their own butt, I would have called to, uh, give me a free night. How about that?
Exactly. It kind of reminds me, Ryan, of all those people who organized against us for the insurance policy, who are unwilling to re-examine their actions now that we have President-elect Trump. And, it's like, we told you so. We told you this is where the voters' heads were, that they were unhappy with the direction of the country and the Biden administration, and no one listened. But now they won't give it to us, Ryan. They will
No,
not.
I know. They won't. Well, I will say that it's really been something. And they'll go nameless. Everybody who's listening probably knows who we're talking about. But there's been all these postmortems after the election, and there were these people getting quoted saying like, "Wow, the Democratic Party, they've been listening too much to the left. They have to move to the center." And I'm reading it and I'm like, where were you at any point over the last 4 years? You said nothing. Not once did you raise your hand up to suggest anything was awry, that maybe you needed better ideas, maybe you needed a better candidate. Not that I'm saying I told you so, but I am saying I told you so.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think, you know, regardless what people thought about it before, we were right. And we gave voice to an incredible number of American voters who did not want the rematch, who did not want more of the same for the country. And I so believe in my heart that had we been able to attract the type of candidates that we wanted, we'd be in such a different place right now.
Yeah, I agree. Well, this week now with a little bit of distance between the election, we're talking to somebody to give us a broader sense of what it means. We get into Senate races, governor's races. One of the other things we talk about is, there is this thing where both parties have a tendency to overread what happened. Yes, Democrats got a thumping, as former President Obama once said. On the other hand, if 250,000 votes had went the other way in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, Kamala Harris would be the next president, which should argue for a little bit of humility on the winning side, that this majority you won could be very transient, and if you overstep, could go away very quickly.
Absolutely. And for the other side, for the Democrats who are doing that introspection, yes, it was only 250,000 votes, but it was against Donald Trump, who we know 30% of his own party did not want to have to vote for him.
Yeah.
So, and I saw some former colleagues just today in the press basically saying it wasn't that big of a deal. It was. And, I think the really interesting thing is, while the Democratic Party figures out how to be competitive for the 2024 election, President-elect Trump, with his ally in Elon Musk, is really moving the ball further down the field. And the one thing that the MAGA Trump world didn't really have until now was a vision of the future and ideas. I mean, really, they had one idea, the wall. But Elon Musk is, for as long as their egos can stand to be in the same room, Elon Musk is going to supercharge that. And the Democratic Party, through its alliances with organized labor, is tied to many groups that don't want to change. And they're going to
Yes.
really have to, fight that out, which brings me to, obviously, I worked for the Democratic Leadership Council for many years. I've heard a lot of people say we need a DLC. And that's true, but it wasn't just a DLC, it was a couple of key individuals who were very courageous
Yeah.
and who were willing to have some really tough fights.
And look, obviously what's needed here isn't just Democratic Party finding its way back to the center. It's making sure there's enough Republicans who want to go to the same place, because so many of these challenges coming down the pike, whether it's immigration, debt, whatever else, they can't be solved by one party or by executive order. I mean, you really do have to find some consensus somehow on those issues. Well, look, let's get to our speaker today, who we're very excited to have. It's Jessica Taylor from Cook Political Report. There are a lot of political prognosticators out there who get every call wrong, and then they very confidently proclaim what's going to happen in the future. The reason that you should listen to Jessica is that Cook got almost everything right in terms of their Senate calls, the Senate races they identified as toss-ups, split entirely 50-50. They got almost every House race right. And she talks through about how they did that. And it's not just by staring at polls. There's some clever ways they get at this. So everybody, for a little perspective on what happened last week's election, not just for the president, but for Senate, House, and state races. Enjoy Jessica Taylor, this week's No Labels Talk. Hello, everybody. This is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, with this week's edition of No Labels Talk. So last week, a couple days after the election, we were still digesting what happened. We kind of talked about what did the election mean. We wanted to get a little bit of a broader perspective from Jessica Taylor from Cook Political Report. Jessica, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
A little bit about Jessica, who covers mostly Senate and governors for Cook Political, really a veteran of lots of campaign and political coverage, has been with NPR, among other places, edited the Almanac of American Politics. A lot to get to, Jessica. I want to start with this, though. About half an hour before we got on the call, some significant breaking news. Looks like President-elect Trump is set to choose Matt Gaetz, Florida congressman, as his next attorney general. Lots of people have lots of different thoughts about Matt Gaetz, but I want to start with something you would have a particular view on, which is, do you think he can get confirmed by the Senate?
Yeah, I think Trump is really testing his boundaries of bending this new Senate majority, which it looks like is going to be at 53 seats, to his will. I think this is the toughest one he has. I think that he engendered a lot of goodwill with Marco Rubio at state. I think Hegseth at defense was certainly an interesting pick and could test the boundaries too, but then Matt Gaetz kind of blew everything out of the water. I start with kind of the biggest question marks in the Republican majority, and that's Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. So you move them, you get down to 51. You still need two more. And, I'm looking at some of the other ones that are up for election. Tom Tillis has certainly shown a tendency to buck his party, but if he votes against this, it could certainly invite a primary challenge if he runs for re-election in 2026. You look at some of the other people like Bill Cassidy that voted for impeachment that are also up in 2026, although that is a little bit of a different thing with, they have sort of a jungle primary there. John Cornyn, also up in 2026. So some of these people that might be sort of seen as more in the, establishment line, I think there's a real question of what they're going to do. And does that invite a primary challenge?
Right.
The new Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, is a little bit more inoculated because he isn't up for reelection until 2028. Um, I think I could really see a couple more flipping. I think this is
Yeah.
a really tough one.
Well, and of course, there is a precedent for a president not necessarily getting the AG they
Mhm.
want. I think, was it Zoe Baird early
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
term? President Clinton, of course, put up Zoe Baird. I think she had some issues with
It was
some.
with her nanny. There was issues with her nanny. Yeah.
Right, right. Yes. And then Janet Reno ultimately came
Mhm.
in behind that. Okay, so sounds like we have a lot of wild cards. And of course, you only need to lose, I guess it would be he could lose 3 because he'd get the tie breaking.
Yeah. He could lose 3. You'd have JD Vance breaking the tie. And then, yeah, but if you lose, so like I said, I don't see a world in which Collins and Murkowski vote to confirm him. And then it just comes down to, the rest of, again, not sure Mitch McConnell would vote to confirm him. And
Yeah.
Mitch McConnell's probably not running for reelection in 2026. So that gives him, certainly more freedom in that regard. Yeah, I'm just seeing a tweet come across here, Joni Ernst saying, well, he's got his work cut out for him on Matt Gaetz. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, this could get real interesting.
Yeah, there's gonna be a lot of senators the next couple of days saying, I look forward to learning more, which you can all just read as a delaying tactic.
Yeah, I would really wish we could have a spotlight on Kevin McCarthy right now and see his reaction.
Yes, yes. Oh boy, if we could just have like the candid camera on him, that
Yeah.
would be great. All right, well, that's helpful in giving us the lay of the land. Can't really forecast where the future is going to go, though. I would say this: Cook Political did do a pretty good job predicting the future in this election.
Yeah.
Couple things to just note here. You were 100% accurate in
Mhm.
your Senate ratings. The toss-ups you identified actually went 50-50.
Mhm.
Even in the House, your lean likely ratings, it looks like we were just doing a rough count. It looks like you got like 43 out of 44 of those.
Yeah, that's my colleague Aaron Cuppy who's in charge of those. Yeah, and we were actually the only ones that had Pennsylvania even at toss up. Everyone else had it in lean dim. So yeah.
All right, so here's a question. Yeah, how do you do that? Because there's no shortage of commentary. People feel like pollsters and prognosticators don't know anything, and they always get things wrong. And yet, you got quite a bit right here.
Mhm.
How?
I think that we have really good sources within the campaigns, within the committees, and we see a lot of data that isn't public. And I think sometimes the public data is not as informed as the private data because I think, there's a lot of, I think, sort of poo-pooing, internal polls and different things. But like I think some of these internal pollsters, they have more skin in the game, because you're trying to get clients, you're trying to keep them, you want to have it more accurate in different things. And, so we see a lot of things from both sides and, that so I think it's talking with sources on the ground, seeing what's moving, looking at sort of the ad buys and different things. So I think that I've always said this sort of, we look at things both quantitatively and qualitatively. So it's, some places will just purely average the polls or weight things and different things. But, I think that we look at more than that when we're doing things.
So a little art along with the science.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I was curious that if you do look at, do you look at all at the betting markets, like a predicted or a poly
I
market?
don't.
You
Mm-mm.
don't. What do you think of those? Because they did, at least at the presidential level, it was interesting. I was watching that on election night, and I think it kind of started. Trump was at like, they do it relative to $1. So I think if Trump was at 56 cents and Harris was at 42, and very quickly popped up to the mid 60s, and then up into $1, of course, because he won. But do you think those have some accuracy? Do you put any stock in those, even if Cook Political doesn't formally work it into its process?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to make of them. I think I'm completely not a betting person, so I think they're just sort of anathema to me. Like and I even follow sports and I don't even follow like the betting line on games and different stuff really. So I think I am just like, that is just a world that is completely foreign to me. So I guess I just don't really pay attention to it at all.
Very, very interesting. Well, I do follow that. Maybe I'm just projecting my failed
Yeah.
football betting onto
Yeah.
politics. Um,
I think I get nervous enough during football games, like, so I think I just couldn't add money on the line to it. Just too much for me.
um, I want to ask you about what you think the meaning of this election
Yeah.
was, because I've read two different perspectives on this in the last couple days, which is obviously the one we've heard a lot about is this is a realignment election.
Mhm.
This was President Trump becoming the first Republican to win the popular vote in 20 years, taking the Senate, taking the House, picking up huge increases in margins among a lot of groups Republicans haven't done well in the past. Young people, Black people, Hispanic people, on down the line. On the other hand, if you just look at the swing states, if 250,000 votes went the other way in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania,
Mhm.
Kamala Harris would be the next
Yeah.
president. So what's your read on what really happened?
I think, sort of, to go back to James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. I think that was the people were telling us that was their overarching concern, followed by immigration. And I think that bore it out when you saw the gains where Trump made gains and where Democrats, I think it was just a repudiation of the current administration and of the sort of current status quo. I think that Harris's biggest issue, I think, as a lot of Democrats would say, she had 107 days to sort of turn this around. That's not a lot of time. And the fact that sort of she was coming from within the administration. And I think probably the moment the campaign was decided was that question she was asked during the View of where would you differ from the current administration? And she couldn't say anything. And that just sort of became a lasting image. Um, Again, you can talk about abortion, you can talk about certainly issues of democracy and different things, but when people can't afford groceries and they can't afford their mortgages and they can't afford gas, that affects everything. And I think that just became the overarching concern. And that's where Trump was able to, make gains. And also, I think the Biden administration didn't take the immigration crisis seriously enough until sort of the 11th hour. They can say that we put a forward this proposal in the Senate that Trump torpedoed, but they had other many years before that to try to address this. Um, and certainly you can take into account everything that happened post-COVID, but the economy is what the economy is right now. And when people are just, it just comes down, I think, to the price of eggs. And that Trump was promising something different. And certainly there's debate by economists over his tariffs and things could actually have adverse effects and different things. But I think they did not, again, Harris was a continuation of the Biden administration. And, again, the most telling statistic to me when I was looking at the exit polls coming out on election night, when 70% of the country says that you're on the wrong track, the incumbent and the incumbent's party does not get reelected in elections like that.
One thing you were watching in a lot of your reporting,
Mhm.
Jessica, was the content of the political advertising
Mhm.
we were looking at this cycle, particularly in the Senate races. So
Yeah.
if you look at the presidential ads, you saw a lot, of course, from the Harris campaign about reproductive rights and democracy and Trump's characterological defects, let's call them. Trump, for his part, a lot on inflation, immigration, and of course that ad on the gender identity issue,
Yeah.
which really did seem to move the electorate. But what about the Senate races? Were they running on the same things, or were there any races where the tenor and issues of the debate were notably different from what we saw at the national level?
I mean, you did, I think, see some of the senators had more concrete things that they had done to point to. And I think that made a difference when you look at some of the senators that won, like Tammy Baldwin. She talked about working to, make sure that construction projects in the US or infrastructure projects are made with US steel. I think that she had she could talk about the ag bill and different things, and she had a better relationship with the dairy community and certainly things there. I think one that listen, I think he was running against Kari Lake, so it's grading on a curve, certainly. But Ruben Gallego did address the border in a lot of his ads. And I think that made a difference, especially, and he could talk to sort of Latino men in a different way because he is one. So I think, there, and then, Jackie Rosen, I think, the race tightened up there near the end as a function of the presidential race, but her very first ad was on housing prices. And so I think that you had senators that really kind of understood, I think, the economic anxieties in a different way than I think the presidential race broke through. And yes, you saw a lot of super PAC ads and the campaign ads emphasizing abortion and different things, but they were also running economic focused messages and, sort of pushing back, I think, against some things. I thought Alyssa Slotkin on the EV mandate had a really good sort of retort and in her debates where she's saying, listen, I'm not going to buy an EV car, but like if we're going to make them, I want them made in Michigan, and that we should have these battery plants, but I'm not going to make you drive this car, and I'm going to continue to drive a gas powered vehicle. So again, I look at sort of the places where they were successful, and I think it is because they had a more localized message. But then, even candidates that did have that, Sherrod Brown and John Tester were running very locally focused advertising as well. But I think, again, political gravity sets in. And when Trump wins Montana by 20 points and Ohio by 12 points, we are just not in that era of ticket splitting where that is possible.
Right.
And even some of these Senate candidates ran slightly behind Harris, but like but what I think is more telling to me when I'm looking at this, in terms of raw votes, there's just some drop off that happens between the presidential and the Senate races, but every single Senate candidate ran in many places significantly behind Trump. And if they had even become closer to his margin, let me pull up our data here too, so I've got it in front of me. But in Nevada, then you can vote for none of the above and none of these candidates. And if Sam Brown had gotten even half of that, he probably would be a senator right now. There were third party candidates in Michigan and in Wisconsin that took more of the vote than was the difference in between. But like ultimately these Republican candidates, I think the Trump mantle is just not transferable
Right.
to some of these candidates. I think, again, there's no better example of that than Kari Lake. No one is more MAGA than her, but sort of her brand of, her brand of MAGA and election denialism was just flatly rejected by people. She came in with such high negatives when Trump was even able to win that state. So, again, in the closest states, Michigan and Wisconsin, the drop off was smaller, but significant. But, again, in Nevada here, Sam Brown, I think, ran behind Trump by more than 4 points. I mean, spending mattered here too. And a lot of people just didn't know who he was. I was listening to a focus group even just a couple of weeks before the election, and these people had no idea who Sam Brown was.
Wow. Of course, the independents, to the extent there were any in these kinds of races, didn't really have a shot to win, though they could in some cases shape the outcome. The exception, of course, was in Nebraska, where there was a really credible independent candidate in Dan Osborne, who really put a scare into Deb Fischer, the incumbent Republican. She ended up winning, I think, was it by 7 or 8 by the time the night was out. But do you think that's something that's repeatable and something we're going to see more of in future cycles, or was that unique to Nebraska?
That's a really good question. More so than I think Dan Osborne being an independent, which I think he wouldn't have been able to do this. And I think probably what did drag him down at the end was that he was getting most of the Democratic support, and that the major outside group funding him, retired career politicians, was getting a lot of funding from, 1630 fund, like getting a lot of money from a liberal group. I think just his background spoke to people, that he wasn't a politician, that he, you look at sort of the other, and I compared it really early on. Listen, I was really skeptical that he would even catch fire. I resisted moving this race for a long time, and we eventually ended up with lean Republican, and sort of the margin there was right, because we've sort of seen this happen in Kansas in 2014. We saw this in Alaska in 2020. We saw this in Utah in 2022. But I think what the difference was with Greg Orman, with Al Gross, with God, I'm even forgetting the name of the Utah guy, Evan McMullen.
Oh,
Yeah, so again, still catching up on sleep from a week ago, you know. They were all very political. They'd been in politics, worked in politics, been political donors. Like Osborne just came across like, you know, his ads, I think, were the best I'd seen all cycle. You
right.
know, like he's taking a blowtorch to the ads on television, and one of his consultants said, you know, like we actually had a safety memo about like, you know, like what happens when you take like a blowtorch to an LCD TV, things I did not think about, you know.
Yeah,
um, but again, like he was like you know, he said at one point, like, if I'm elected, $176,000 would be a pay increase for me. And like hardly anyone in the Senate could say that. So I think just his, I'm not a politician, like I'm working, you know, I'm one of you, like I work in a factory, kind of really broke through. And can that be replicated? You know, I think it's just hard because like as I know you all have dealt with, like, you know, we have the two-party system, and kind of coming up from that is just really hard because I don't think it works unless you have one party sit out, in which case the Democrats did, that could happen. Um, and where do you get your funding from and different stuff like that? And I think a lot of his funding was still coming through Act Blue, was largely being bankrolled by Democrats. You know, he had like Julia Louis-Dreyfus tweeting out for him and stuff too. So like there was certainly more enthusiasm from him, sort of from that populist wing. Um, and you know, I think that kind of like he was a dark horse for so long, but then I think the spotlight on that just made it really hard in a
yeah.
presidential year. So maybe in a midterm year or something like that could be more successful. But I think if it's going to work, I do think it has to come from someone that's like outside of politics, that kind of comes across as really genuine.
Yeah. Well, he didn't just come across that way, as you noted.
No, he was. Yeah.
Yeah, lots of politicians say, I'm like you,
Mhm.
put on, you know, the jean jacket that they bought, you know, 2 days ago. This is a union guy who
Yeah.
worked at the factory.
Yeah, worked in a cereal factory and then worked as a pipe fitter. Like, I mean, yeah, he was, like I said, he was not sort of, you know, he did not come from the political class. And I think that was the key difference. I really do think.
You know, everybody fixates so much on the national elections for obvious reasons, but there were plenty of state elections, including lots of different ballot initiatives and referendum. One of the things that we were looking at, we thought was interesting, was ranked choice voting was on the ballot in 8 different places.
Yeah.
It lost in 6, was repealed in 1, Alaska. The only place that implemented it was Washington, DC,
Mhm.
actually. So that's, you know, no labels obviously is one group that took a look at our political system and said, oh, you know, it's kind of broken. We thought maybe a third option in the presidential race was the way around it. Other people have, you know, pushed various voting reforms, ranked choice voting being one of them. Do you have any sense why it was so resoundingly rejected by voters last Tuesday?
I mean, I think there was organization behind it this time to defeat it, because I think both political parties, like in Nevada, you had to push back against it from both Republicans and Democrats. And then in Alaska, you know, have we seen the end of that? You know, certainly got Mary Peltola into Congress. It doesn't look like she's going to survive, but, you know, protected Lisa Murkowski in that. And I think that gave her sort of more freedom to, you know, certainly vote for Trump's impeachment. Listen, this is one of the things I'm really interested in, because I think if you're looking at sort of, if just sort of you get down to it where it's gerrymandering, we have fewer competitive seats. If, you know, if a politician's main goal is to get reelected, and you get that way, you know, when your biggest threat is in a primary and not in a general election any longer, there's such little incentive to compromise, then, you know, sort of shaking up the type of system can lead to more, you know, to more bipartisanship. But these places that rejected it, it looks like we're kind of taking a step back when Alaska's is repealed and different things. You know, because I do think, you know, sort of the places that have a top primary system that is still there, I think that's the question of, you know, can you still see, you know, people still get elected, you know, like that are sort of more toward the middle, like in Washington State, like Marie Goldskamp Perez and different things, and then in California and stuff, and Louisiana. So I think, sort of these last bastions of where at least you do have an all-party primary system can make a difference, but it's not completely, it did sort of feel like for a little bit like there was this little bit of momentum, but as you said, it did feel like it took a big step back on Tuesday, which I think is, in the grand scheme of things, has gotten lost a little bit.
Yeah. Before we get to questions, and if anybody does have questions, just hit the little raise hand button, and we'll get to you in a minute. But the last question I had for you was, I did want to ask about the other state level races. Found really interesting, particularly governor's races. Were there races for governor that you found particularly surprising in terms of the outcome? Also, are there governors you think we should be keeping an eye on because you think they're up and comers? And I'm thinking here, maybe governors one step below the Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer. Most people already know who these people are. What were you paying attention to last Tuesday? A little under the radar.
Yeah, well, let me answer. I think some of the people I am paying attention on because Spencer Cox is really interesting to me, because he is someone that I think has tried to sort of marshal some of this bipartisanship. With being head of the NGA, when he ran his first race, he actually filmed an ad with his Democratic opponent.
He's a Republican. Utah.
Yeah, he's a Republican. And he faced a primary challenge because of it, and actually lost lost at the convention, which Utah has this sort of Byzantine convention system, though now you can still get on the primary ballot, and he won. And then actually his primary challenger ran as a write-in candidate and didn't really merit anything. He got 10% of the vote still, but 9% it looks like. So there is sort of that protest vote against him, but I think he is someone that is genuinely vested. And Utah is so interesting to me because it sort of does resist Trumpism a little bit. It had Mitt Romney, though Romney didn't run. And I think John Curtis is he's not going to be a Michael Lee. I don't know that he's going to be full, sort of Mitt Romney-esque, but he is somewhat there in between. He actually appointed to his office Boyd Matheson, who was a Democratic member there too. So you do sort of see some of that. So Spencer Cox is really interesting to me. I am still interested by some of these governors that still represent the states of the opposite party. What does Andy Beshear do? He's term limited. Laura Kelly in Kansas as well. And then, in Vermont, there too, the governor. So I am kind of interested by those. The governor's races, they weren't super interesting this cycle. I think the ones that we thought were going to be really competitive, like North Carolina, weren't after that whole scandal. And I think Mark Robinson was on his way to lose even before the whole porn site thing and stuff too. But North Carolina actually, even though Trump won that state, they actually kind of elected sort of more moderate people up and down the ballot, more sort of moderate Democrats, not even just Josh Stein for governor, but they elected the Democratic Lieutenant Governor, Rachel Hunt, elected a Democratic Attorney General and Jeff Jackson. And then there was the Superintendent of Public Instruction race, which is essentially the Secretary of Education, that there was a very sort of right-wing Republican there who'd actually even had put on social media that Obama should have been before a firing squad. So she lost. It was very close, but she still lost. So, North Carolina, even there was sort of hope there, I think, for Democrats, even amidst that. The one that did win was Kelly Ayotte. So that was really the last competitive race there. And, I think certainly she was helped by the fact that Trump did better than expected in New Hampshire, but she ran ahead of him. And to me, this was, I think, about the economy and about safety, because I think those were Joyce Craig's. She was the Democratic nominee, the former mayor of Manchester. Knox against her from her tenure there. And Ayotte was really kind of able to sort of neutralize the abortion issue a lot, by saying, New Hampshire has restrictions and more restrictions than sort of other New England states, but it's still a 24-week ban with exceptions for, medical, emergencies in the third trimester. So she really sort of ran about that. She ran an ad about how she'd had a miscarriage. So I think she kind of provided Republicans and Republican women in particular a way to talk about this, and governors' races where we've seen governors be more penalized on abortion initiatives than perhaps senators have been.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's a reminder that people always try to, you know, let's learn the one big lesson from this election, but there's a lot of different lessons and they
Yeah.
don't all land in the same direction. One of the things No Labels is always talking about is, you know, yes, Republicans won a pretty resounding victory at the national level. On the other hand, as we said at the outset of a lot of terms, don't pretend like it's 1984 or 1932. One of these you know, when Ronald Reagan won 49 states,
Mhm.
FDR had 70
Yeah.
people in Congress. There's some humility that would be nice to see.
I mean, I also think that, one of Biden's biggest flaws is that he fundamentally misread the 2022 midterms as well. That
Yes,
this was some sort of sweeping mandate for Democrats when they still lost the House. Yes, they did not lose as many seats as they thought they were going to. And they made gains in the Senate, but that was largely because of flawed Republican candidates. And so I think that was a fundamental misreading in the same way that, 2020 was not an overwhelming victory as well, as you mentioned, is how close those, 250,000 votes between those, it was less than that, in 2020. And so, I don't think that we're a country of where, like you said, that 1984 landslide of only Minnesota and DC is going to happen again. So I think that should be a caution to Republicans not to overread into this, which again, when I look at some of Trump's cabinet appointments, if we see, I think that he very well could be in the same way that the Biden administration overread into the 2022 midterms because they sort of defied history in that regard when it was really more about individual races. And I think when you dig into some of these, like I said, I think there's a big question to me of you look at the leadership of the Democratic Party too, and it doesn't look like Jamie Harrison's going to run again. Someone like Ben Wickler in Wisconsin, where they did the best of any state and still won that Senate race, is someone to look to. But also, you have the leader of the Senate Democrats from New York, this number two from Illinois. If Gavin Newsom comes up as a presidential candidate from, another sort of California liberal, is that the right direction for a party when most of middle America feels left behind, when it's someone, I always thought from the beginning, listen, if this had been a free-for-all primary, say Biden says after 2022 he's not going to run again, someone like Gretchen Whitmer would have been much stronger. And I still don't think that even picking Shapiro as VP would have fundamentally changed things because people vote for the top of the ticket. But
right.
I'm really looking at his reelection and how he's able, what happens there in Pennsylvania in 2026 as a blueprint. But I think there's a lot of other Democratic leaders that are rising up that aren't from, and you even look in the House, they're all from New York or Massachusetts or California. So I think they've really kind of got to do some soul searching of, can we kind of continue to appoint these, sort of coastal elites in a way?
Hey, I say this as a proud New Yorker. New York does not represent the country, and we can use a lot more geographic representation. Let's get to some questions, starting with Al, and if everybody could just say where they're calling in from. Al, go ahead.
Sure, Jessica. My name's Al Bartell, and I live here in Georgia, metropolitan Atlanta particularly. My question goes to the kind of attention that certain special interest groups or cultural groups got during the election cycle, particularly Black men. And the most surprised by that kind of attention was Black men. So my question is, in the U.S. Senate races that are up in 2026, particularly in the state of Georgia, was that a public policy phenomenon or a public relations phenomenon that got picked up by the media? Which one of those kind of carried the day that's going to roll over into 2026 for the U.S. Senate races?
That's a good question. You all have one of the most important Senate races coming up there in 2026 that I'm certainly keeping my eye on because, again, if Republicans have a 53 seat majority, they need 4 seats. the biggest ones that Democrats will target are in Maine and North Carolina, but they've still got to defend. I think John Ossoff is probably the #1 most vulnerable incumbent in that regard. And especially if Republicans are able to get Brian Kemp to run there, that becomes the marquee race of the cycle.
Yeah.
You know, I also think Raphael Warnock is someone that can speak to that constituency, and that I think certainly he helped juice turnout in both 2020 and 2022, that helped in Georgia in those
Yeah.
runoff elections, and where he was able to outperform every other Democrat on the ballot in 2022 in Georgia.
Yeah.
So I think I kind of looked at even sort of the way the Harris campaign approached it, and almost felt like they were sort of lecturing Black men in a way
Yes.
what they
Yes.
should believe in. And so whereas I think, the Trump administration, the Trump team did actually go to some of these podcasts and different things. And so I think they kind of went to where the community was. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure that the Harris campaign did that. So
It didn't. It didn't.
Thanks, Al. Bill.
Thanks. Jessica, I think this is in your bailiwick, but were you at all surprised by Thune's election today to lead the Senate?
yeah. I was not. I thought that Thune was sort of always the front runner, and the pressure campaign to get Rick Scott elected, I never thought was going to work. Unlike for the House Speaker, this was a secret ballot election. I think senators have sort of much larger purviews and are not swayed as much by House members. The Senate, I think, still, even though you've seen, I sort of call them sort of the rabble rouser caucus of like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, and Rick Scott fits in there, and Mike Lee, you still have a lot of institutionalists left. And so, we do sort of often see sort of going to the next person. I always thought it was going to be Thune or Cornyn. The question was where sort of those other votes went. But I think, Rick Scott is a very divisive figure within the Republican caucus there. And also it matters what you've done for these members. And Thune went this cycle and he campaigned for a lot of them. He raised money for them. And that kind of currency goes a long way when you're trying to pick the leader. So I wasn't surprised.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor, for your good analysis of the election outcome. One thought, in the 2022 midterms, abortion was such a powerful, even dominant issue. Why do you think it was not in 2024 figuring it at all, it seems to me?
Because I think in a lot of places they had the option to vote for a referendum and then for a different candidate. So Arizona, Nevada, they could pass these referendums. It didn't pass in Florida, but that was because it had to hit 60%. So a lot of these places, Michigan, they already have a law on the books now. It sort of removed it as a consideration. And we were seeing in our polling that ultimately voters still didn't believe that Trump was going to back a national abortion ban that was going to sort of threaten their individual laws. So I think that sort of, a lot of voters still don't see him as sort of a real religious right candidate, which he isn't. And they kind of still see him as that sort of New York playboy, and that he's not going to endanger this, even though he appointed the people to the justices to the Supreme Court that overturned it. So I think, again, those abortion referendums in a lot of states gave people the option to vote to enshrine the rights, but also they could vote for a candidate that they felt was more aligned with their position on other issues, particularly on the economy and immigration.
Yes, thank you. Brian, you indicated earlier that No Labels had considered running a third-party candidate, which we did not. It was suggested at that time that it would be helpful to Trump if we had done so. Based on the data that we've seen since subsequently after the election, how do you think a good third-party candidate might have impacted the results?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yes.
Based on the data we had at the time, I still think that they could have drawn sort of more from Biden. I think and could have helped Trump, but I think just the fact that there was just Biden there, actually, if you wanted another option other than Biden, that was going to go to Trump, because he ended up as sort of the only other option. But I think we probably still would have ended up with the same outcome, probably, had there been a third party candidate.
Two questions from Richard Allen from New Hampshire. There are now three prospective cabinet members, Louise Stefanik, Michael Waltz, and Matt Gaetz, who are all Republican House members. What is the mechanics for replacing them, and does this indicate that there's great confidence that there will be a sufficient majority of Republicans to have control in the House? Because some of these elections haven't been decided. That's number one. Number two, there's this discussion of changing the location, such as the EPA, from Washington to other locations in the country. This would be a rather significant change historically. Do you think that would have any effect on the dynamics of on the elections of the future?
Yeah. So for House members, unlike senators, and I have a piece up that just went up on Cook actually looking at it, because we know there's going to be a vacancy in Ohio. Governor Mike DeWine will fill that, though that person has to stand for a special election in 2026, and then we'll have to run for a full term in 2028. The same thing in Florida, exactly the same, which means that actually both Florida and Ohio will have had successive Senate elections from 2022 through 2030, which if any of you are the gentleman from Georgia, in Arizona, you are familiar with that phenomenon of the unending Senate elections. So in Georgia, you got a little bit of a reprieve. In Arizona, they finally do next year. But House members, there has to be a special election, and it varies by state on how many days that is. All of these members do come from what appear to be safe seats, although we've certainly had weird things happen in special elections. I actually had a Republican say to me, that there have been some really weird New York special elections that have not gone the way that they are supposed to in both Republicans and Democrats' favor. So that vacancy and with Stefanik makes them a little nervous. Just looking at the numbers right now, and I think there's the big if Gaetz gets confirmed, but I think certainly the Stefanik and Walz ones are probably safer bets. It really could make things difficult. We still don't know the final margin, but they were at 4 seats. They could be anywhere, I think, between 5, 6, but it still makes it really dicey. So, Speaker Johnson looks like he'll keep his job, but it can make things really interesting when it gets down to it. But I think that would still be temporary, but it could sort of impede some sort of early days things in the Trump administration as well, because that majority is so thin. Oh, and the EPA question. I'm not certain about that. Yeah, I look at more sort of the political implications of things, so I'm not certain about the EPA. I haven't followed that as closely.
Thanks, Jessica. Just one final question from Al. Al, go ahead.
Yeah, Jessica, Al Smith from Connecticut. 2 issues. Do you think we'll ever get any traction? One is the national debt, and the other is education. They always seem to be pushed to the side, and I think are both very, very important.
I mean, I think, we certainly saw a focus on the national debt and, with the Tea Party movement and different things. And Trump has certainly talked about that, but then he increased spending a lot as well in his first term. So who knows? And then the Department of Education, that is sort of a, frequent sort of target in different things, but it would sort of take an act of Congress to do this in that regard. So I think that's still, we will see what happens. I do feel like we are in some uncharted waters with many things in a second Trump administration. So we will see.
Thanks, Al. Jessica, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hope you can get some sleep, but really appreciate your insights. Great job. Congratulations on Cook Political's Nostradamus Act. You really did call it, and we'll look forward to talking again soon.
Thank you very much.